G'day, I'm Dr Martin Laverty. I'm both the Chief Executive of the Royal Flying Doctor Service of Australia and the Deputy Chair of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. I'm delighted to be at the University of Newcastle in Ourimbah this afternoon, where we're going to be talking about the role of corporate governance, with a particular focus on culture and ethics, which are so important given the many Royal Commissions looking into governance at the moment. I hope you find this afternoon's discussion useful.
Welcome everybody to the Central Coast Not-for-Profit Forum. This is our second forum for 2019. And before we get started, I'll invite Dr Prof Glenn from the University of Newcastle to come up and say a few words.
Welcome to the wonderful campus here at the University of Newcastle. It's a pleasure and a delight to see you all here. Let me begin by acknowledging the Darkingham people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. The Darkingham have been teaching and learning on these lands for many thousands of years, and the University is very proud to continue on in that tradition. It's a real delight to see you here, and I commend Paul and Yvette from Fortunity for their foresight in setting up a series of fora to discuss issues of governance, ethics, culture in the not-for-profit sector. The university is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year in 2019 in terms of operating from this campus. This partnering with Fortunity to engage with a broader section of the community is certainly something that we saw as an event to hold within that 30 years. Governance is a challenge for us all, whether you're on a governing body, on a board, or whether you're a senior management executive working to board. That boundary condition between governance and management is tricky. It's a function of feeds and chemistry and experience and talent, bias, prejudice, but it's moving. Can you hear me? Speak up. I have a soft voice. I was trying to speak up. But the important thing is that there's lots of academic knowledge and skill, and we have some lecturers here who teach in this space. My sense is that the best lessons are also around sharing knowledge and experience, how others have found it, how others are doing it, how others are doing it well. And I'm delighted that Martin Laverty could join us from the Flying Doctor Service to share with us his experience and his wisdom. So Paul, I'll thank you and leave you to introduce Martin. Thank you.
So our agenda for today is Martin's presentation, question and answer session at the end if you have any questions. We'll briefly touch on our third forum, which will be held in August of this year. Now, nowhere could I find in Martin's presentation was a plug for his organisation, so I thought I'd do him the favour of doing it himself. So the Royal Flying Doctor Service began as a single leased Qantas plane in 1928. For today, the RFDS operates 71 aircraft across 23 air bases. It looks something like this. The RFDS helps someone every 2 minutes of every day, providing primary health care, emergency services for those that live and work in about 7.7 square kilometres of Australia. The RFDS has been recognised as Australia's most reputable charity. Now, for the nerds in the room, this is what's happening right now. This is a live feed from the RFDS of planes currently in the air. New South Wales is pretty busy at the moment, isn't it? You can go on their website and check it out. I thought it was cool. So anyway. To introduce Martin. Adjunct Professor Martin Laverty has been the Chief Executive Officer of the Royal Flying Doctor Service since 2014. Martin is also a Board Director of the National Disability Insurance Agency and is Deputy Chair of the Australian Not-for-Profits and Charities Commission's Advisory Board. He's Adjunct Professor at the University of Western Australia's Not-for-Profit Research Group in the Faculty of Law and Business. don't hold it against him, but he's a lawyer by training and holds a master's degree in Indigenous constitutional laws. And his doctoral thesis was on board director contributions to organisational outcomes. He's edited and contributed 2 books on social determinants and is currently writing a new book on the purpose of Australia's not-for-profit sector. Martin is married with 3 primary school aged children and has driven up from Canberra today to be with us. Would you please welcome Dr. Martin Laverty.
Can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of this beautiful land on which so many of you are lucky to live. Each time I acknowledge the country that I'm on, I recommit the Royal Flying Doctor Service to doing what it can to the advancement of our First Nations. Each year we'll see about 180,000 Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders through the service. And unfortunately, for those First Australians that we care for, they will live lives 11 years shorter than the other 150,000 Australians that we care for each year. They will be 3 times as sicker, and they will live with an avoidable chronic illness that is simply not just. And as a wealthy nation, we have opportunity to support First Australians. So each time I make that acknowledgement, I go back to our purpose, to know that we must all work together to advance the health and well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Purpose is something I'm going to talk a lot about, and in fact, having just broken the machine, I can take the opportunity to thank Brock for joining us this afternoon and for welcoming us all to the university, and also to Paul and Yvette for bringing these gatherings together. We're all here in a common purpose. In whatever capacity you work, volunteer within the not-for-profit and the charitable sector, you're there for a purpose. So at the start of a lecture that's going to run for about an hour and 20 minutes or so before taking your questions, I might be giving the game away to say I've only got one thing to say, and that's purpose. That your governance of your not-for-profit or your charitable organisation or your role in management will be successful if you understand and you work in favour of your purpose. It might sound simple, but it's stunningly complex, because the governance system that we've inherited to work within in Australia is actually built around profit. And we're trained as directors to pursue profit. That we understand. I'm married to an accountant, I understand it exceptionally well. But in the not-for-profit sector, we don't have a good vehicle for defining what the purpose, be it charitable or not-for-profit purpose of your organisation is, and then to know how to build the system of achieving that purpose. So if you leave with only one word for everything that I say today, it's purpose. What's the purpose for which you are governing? And is everything that you govern and manage orientated around that purpose? And at every meeting, at every significant event, are you reconnecting to that purpose of your organisation? And if you have that worked out, you'll probably be making the best possible contribution to the outcome of your organisation. So what I'm going to share with you today comes in 3 broad parts. I've been asked to address culture and ethics of our governance frameworks in the not-for-profit and charity sector in Australia today. So I'm going to step through ethics first, culture, and then situate it within the governance framework. I'm going to take you through my 5-year doctoral study in about 20 minutes and seek to condense it down to a single page, which I've done, and I understand you've got. That it's a bit embarrassing to say at the end of 5 years of work I can fit it into a page, it was that simple. But my study involved interviewing board directors, chair people and chief executives to find out what are the mechanisms in the absence of a vehicle to properly govern charity in Australia because our law is set up for profit, not for charity, what dynamics do you need to have in place within your governance in order to best contribute to your charitable outcomes? That's the thesis distilled into a few words that fits into a page. If I've then said too much, I'm going to take you through some ready help guides, some reckoners that I've also condensed down into a page that might be useful to sit alongside you as you are tackling governance challenges within your organisation. I've included live links to the Ready Help guides as we go through it, and you might find those Ready Help guides useful today or at a later date. You'll leave here with 3 very practical recommendations for you to take back to your organisation and implement. You might also leave here with 3 practical recommendations that you totally ignore or you think are ridiculous, and that would be fine. But along the way, hopefully, you've remembered that if you are focused on the purpose of your organisation and your purpose alone, you will contribute to the outcome of that organisation of which you're part. Now, this is going to work best if you're sitting next to someone you don't know, and I should have warned there's going to be crowd participation. It's too late, the door's closed. Would you turn to someone, ideally that you don't know. I want you to introduce yourself, and then I want you to help solve this conundrum. You and the person next to you are a director of a mid-sized charity who is set up to address hunger. That's all I'm going to tell you about. And you've just been given 2 different donations. One's $1 million, the other's $1,000. And I want you to talk about what you're going to do with that $1 million and $1,000 of donations that you've just received. The only guidance that you're given is that you have to evaluate the $1 million, but other than that, it's entirely over to you. So go be directors, introduce yourself, and determine you're a charity in support of hunger. You've got $1 million and $1,000 to now spend. What are you going to do with it? 2 minutes or so. Go for it. Two or a group of a few like to tell me, what did you do with your $1 million and $1,000? You and I'm looking over this way. So.
We didn't actually get to the point of deciding what to do with it.
Thank you. That's the point. Number 1, we didn't get there. Thank you. You proved it. Someone else.
Depends what's already set up in your
Depends what's set up.
So if you've already got an ER, but I was assuming there's nothing.
So you're employing an executive officer.
Exactly.
Terrific. Didn't get to it, employing an executive officer. So
the $1,000 go and buy some food and hand it out to those that are in need.
yes.
There's no accountability. It's an immediate impact.
So no accountability. Hold on to that. No accountability.
And the $1 million, sit back opportunity, get a strategy, investment opportunity for looking for the longer term.
One final, sir.
Our 1,000 was straight to the purpose. Get it out there that week. I think the next day, making a difference in feeding some people, making a difference with the gift boxes, things like that. There's always people out there in need. That's not the time. The $1 million is looking at a program that's not out there that would make a significant impact in the community.
Very good. What we've just proven is the diversity of responses about how to use a resource that falls in your plate. I'm not being critical, but it's not unusual that a board of directors doesn't get to it, that they're busy doing something else. I'm not teasing you individually.
We never met before we
But isn't that we've all sat in a boardroom where the board doesn't get to it, even when they do know each other, and there are systems and there are processes in place. We've employed someone. We've put an executive officer. We've immediately deployed the $1,000 because it's immediate to purpose. Thank you. You get gold star because you've listened. Purpose. Straight to purpose straight away. But you've also developed a strategy, an investment of your money until you work out how best to deploy. So they're all very legitimate responses. What I didn't give to you was any guidance as to what the purpose of your organisation was beyond hunger. We didn't say, was it for the amelioration, the prevention, the eradication, the response to? Were you a food bank whose job is to put out food? Are you existing for global hunger? Interestingly, no one made any distinction between local or global because there were no strings attached. And you might want to find out what the greatest need is, at least that was acknowledged down here, and in planning, you're looking for the greatest need. Rob Rick, who's at the Harvard Business School and who publishes on purpose charity governance, in his book on why philanthropy is in fact failing democracy, listed some challenges as to why, in fact, charity and the idea of it is somehow misguided and confused. He said that charities often get to the symptoms. So just get $1,000 out the door to feed someone tomorrow because it's immediate. And that's the symptom, if you like, of hunger. I've got no food, that's the symptom. And in doing so, is the charity ignoring what is true justice? In this country where we have a social safety net, I put it to you, it is an injustice that people go without food and live in hunger. And have you as directors all just let justice off the hook by providing a band-aid, if you like, $1,000 in immediate assistance and $1 million to your strategy, rather than saying we want to see the way in which government support people change. Now, I'm being a bit unfair. Those of you who said you're going to employ or you're going to develop a strategy, you might have got to what's the way in which you advocate for policy change. So I am being unfair. The charity may not provide the best solution to the problem. So the $1,000 that was spent, I'm going to guess, went to a supermarket or we somehow arranged a food donation, physical food. Perhaps didn't go to teaching someone about nutrition and how to find food. It didn't teach about growing food. Maybe it didn't get to the root, which was this person has a mental illness, and therefore our purpose could have been better achieved by addressing the underlying determinants of that person's social circumstance. In doing so, has the charity benefited the state rather than the needy? We know that New Start is impossible to live off for a sustained period of time. I'll put it to you even a short period of time. By giving out charity, by feeding the hungry, are we letting the state off the hook? And for all of us involved in raising money from the community and applying it to a charitable purpose, that applies to every single one of us involved in that type of transaction. Again, there's no criticism here. These are just objectives to think about how would you spend your $1,000,000. The charity may lead to favouritism. Now, I struggled with this concept, but what the Harvard professor is suggesting to us is that it's easier to raise money for a child hunger project than it is for an adult. Easier to raise money for kids' cancer than it is for cancer. If you work for the RSPCA, you do a better job of raising money than if it's for domestic violence. It shouldn't be a competition. And in fact, I think competition in the charity sector is anathema. But it's there every single day, and we all live and work within it, and we know it. But favourites arise, and I know that at the moment I work for a very privileged national charity that is loved by country communities, and we are supported. And I could go to a different charity today dealing with a different topic and use the same tools, but perhaps because we don't have the same brand, the same length of tenure, that favouritism may not follow me to my next charity job, and I'm very aware of that. Tax incentives do harm. So the tax system exists to allow some activities to receive their full tax deductibility entitlements and others not. The ones that I think about are private hospitals that are run by charities, or private hospitals that are not run by charities. I know some of you are involved in aged care, some of you will be charities. And then there are commercial charities. And there's a principle called competitive neutrality that says you shouldn't give a concession to one part of the economy when they're involved in the same activity as an actor elsewhere. Why should a charity hospital receive a tax concession when a listed company is delivering the same service and doesn't receive that? And I declare I used to run Catholic Health Australia, a group of charitable hospitals that benefited from that tax concession, but are they fair? Charitable giving is inefficient because I need to get paid to do my job as a chief executive, and that pay has to come from somewhere. So that when the donor is making their contribution, they don't like paying for overheads, but the overheads exist. And without the overheads, the charitable enterprise, the activity, won't exist. The charity may not put the funds to the best use, whether they've got the right skills and capacity to know what is the best way to buy the food to feed the hungry, how to store it, how to get it at the best price, or they might just waste it on their luxury dinners for their board directors. Charities are hardly ever accountable to the giver, and your $1,000 you said came with no accountability. Well, there is a degree of accountability to your receipt of the donation. So the ACNC requires you to disclose your income and be transparent about that. The ACNC doesn't require you to be accountable back to the beneficiary, the recipient of the care. If you're involved in aged care, the accreditation standards require you to be accountable to the town square for your safety and quality. Charity hospitals are the same, and there are regulatory systems, but they're not related to charity. There isn't actually a mechanism whereby you are accountable to the beneficiary. That is the purpose, back to my single word. How does our legal system in Australia hold you as the directors, as the members or the staff, as accountable to the purpose? To some extent, it doesn't exist. It does in the most flimsiest of ways, but not in the way that the stock exchange holds directors accountable for management of profit. Not in the way that the shareholders go to the AGM and action their entitlements if profit's not pursued. In the absence of that, what's the vehicle in which we expect charities to be accountable to the beneficiary? Well, it's mostly founded in ethics, the ethics of the not-for-profit sector. And before we get to being specific to charities and not-for-profits, let's address the role of ethics in governance per se, be it for charities, for-profit organisations as well. You might be a very ethical person, but when you come to the board table, your personal ethics aren't the ethics of the organisation. The ethics of the organisation have to be founded, moulded and articulated to mirror the reason for which the organisation exists. The ethics of the profit motive are very different to the ethics of the charitable motive. And if you have a board of directors of 5, 10 or whatever the number of people is, it's not enough that you've got ethical people there. Yes, you want that to be the start, but you have to form a system of ethics for that group of people to adopt as normal. And I wonder, I'll ask, at your board tables, particularly at induction, has there been a discussion about the ethics of your organisation, the ethics of your governance? Challenge then to expect those ethics to be in place and to be effective. If we then move through from just broad ethics, the need to bond it, to ethics of charity, Bill Shawcross is the now just retired chair of the Charities Commission in the UK, so the equivalent of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. Our ACNC in Australia is modelled on the Charities Commission of the United Kingdom, and I'd say that the Charities Commission in the UK is maybe 20 years more advanced than our own understanding of charity law here in Australia. Why? Well, they've had a 400-year advantage on us. The Statute of Elizabeth, which is now 420 years old, originates in the United Kingdom. It gave voice to the notion of charity. And you see extraordinary institutions in the United Kingdom, many with royal charter, that have existed for centuries. And that practice of civil society in the UK is very different to that in Australia. And there's much we can learn. So when the chair of the Charities Commission in the UK speaks, we at the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission listen. Bill said that ethical behaviour for a charity is living its values. Values founded in its purpose. That charities need to behave as upstanding citizens. And it's too easy for charities to become narrowly focused on a narrow interest, ignorant of what's going on in the world around them. And if you just think about that for a moment, have you ever been in a board or a management meeting of your charity or not-for-profit where you're blaming the outside world? You know, if only they would understand, if only the government would give us more money, if only the regulator would understand, if only the aged care accreditation standards were easier, or whatever version of that event. Not fully recognising the externalities to what it is that is pressuring your own organisation. Bill says that the public expects charities to put beneficiaries first. I mean, that doesn't need to be said. But is it always the case? Always. And if your purpose exists for the beneficiaries, is every single decision you're making about them first, rather than you as a director, or your world experience, or your political view? Is the beneficiary driving everything that you do? But then also, are you being courteous in how you raise your money? Are you being sensitive to the physical environment? Are you being environmentally sustainable? And this is a pressure that we've not yet, I think, felt in Australia. The Charities Commission in the UK is heading in a direction to say climate change is real, and as an actor in civil society, charities should be playing their role in reducing the adverse impact of their operations on the environment. Now, some in Australia wouldn't have any argument with that, some will argue tooth and nail. It's still a contested environment for us here in this country. But a regulator from whom our own regulator takes some guidance is saying charities need to think about their place in the world and their contribution to external events. And Bill concluded by saying, think about the Hippocratic Oath. Do no harm, advance the beneficiaries, but certainly do no harm elsewhere. The way in which you carry out and behave as a charity needs to be consistent with your purpose. So this is a very well-informed view of what ethics inside a charity, at least in the United Kingdom, looks like, and what it requires then of directors. And I don't mind admitting that as a director of different organisations in Australia, and as an executive reporting to a board, I don't pass this test. If I was to audit my past and current behaviours as they sit through this ethical frame, I don't pass this test. And I don't know that too many charities and not-for-profits in Australia would. That's why I said, not to let us all off the hook, we're perhaps 20 years behind the United Kingdom. But where the UK has gone in charity, so too does Australia to follow. And this is a guide I think is very helpful. Bill draws out values. So I thought about that for a while and wondered, where could I capture the values of Australian charities as to how they're expressed? And not to name or shame or embarrass any charity I haven't been associated with. I only went to those that I've had a connection with. The Heart Foundation, I was the chair of the Heart Foundation about 5 years ago. The Smith family, I was their Director of Government about 15 years ago. Muscular Dystrophy, I'm a former Chief Executive of the association. Unison Disability, it's a disability NDIS service provider Here and across parts of northern and western Sydney. I was the chair of Unison a few years ago. Canteen, I was their honorary legal counsel for a while. So each of these I've been involved with, and I've had opportunity to adjust and fix their values. And I failed. Because don't they all look awfully the same? Doesn't everyone want to be collaborative, have integrity, respect, and have innovation? In fact, if you were to use this as a sample, every of the charities, one of which is about heart disease, children's poverty, disability and children's cancer. So in different charities, interested differently, but they've all got the same values of respect, integrity, collaboration, innovation. Now, to some extent, you can't argue with those words. You really can't. And they are the labels that you attribute to ethics. To be ethical is to have integrity. It's not an argument. But I know your charity, you're a not-for-profit organisation, it will have a values statement like this. Do you have a mechanism to embed? Does that mechanism apply to the directors? How do you test it? How do you action it when it's testing the boundaries or breaching them? When you see a lack of respect, particularly at the board table, on an issue where tension is appropriate, but the line to a lack of respect is easily crossed, where collaboration is essential but sometimes factions emerge. Do you have that mechanism of ensuring that if this is indeed your statement, and on my pretty average sample, I'm going to suspect you're going to have some of these words adopted, but are they just words or do they have meaning? So if our values approach is not quite working, what might? What's more detailed than these words that perhaps just become slogans? At the beginning of this year, the National Council of Voluntary Organisations in the United Kingdom published guidance on the specifics of ethical behaviour for charity boards to give meat on bone, if you like, to what being ethical as a board director of a charity in the United Kingdom might be. Because it's fresh and because we don't really have this in Australia, again, I think there's much that we can learn from the UK. And pleasingly, this reinforces my worldview that to be ethical, you must start with clarity of your purpose. You must be able to define in detail, why do you exist? What actions should you then carry out to fulfil that reason for existing? And that becomes a system of ethical governance, if you've got that embedded. That the reason for your existence must be to give the greatest benefit to beneficiaries, regardless of the impact that this will have on your standing or reputation or that of the leadership. Now just think that through for a moment. Charities in Australia have a fraught relationship with advocacy. In fact, governments often take away the ability or constrain the ability for charities to advocate. To be ethical is to hear but advocate in any case, regardless of the negative impact on the reputation or the operation of the charity and its leadership. Now, it's not helpful to advocate or act in a way that puts yourself out of business. You've obviously got to understand this advice within the realms of what's practical. But it's really challenging us to say, if you exist for the beneficiary, it's actually not the reputation of the charity, which is different from the reputation of the individual director. Again, separate them out. When the director comes to the table, they're there in the best interests of the charity. And the reputation of the charity, in an ethical framework, will be secondary to the best interests of the beneficiary. When working with the beneficiaries, you have to be able to ensure their views form part of the decision-making process. Now, for some, this is customer feedback surveys. For others, it will be consumer advisory representation. For Flying Doctors, it's having health consumers on our board, in addition to advisory forums, in addition to regular community engagement and customer feedback surveys. But I know in other charities that I've been involved with, you don't have that same feedback loop. So what the National Council of Voluntary Organisations in the UK is saying is that if you don't have a systematised way of getting the views of your beneficiaries, you're not meeting expectations of ethical behaviour. And that your procedures and your policies all need to reflect the interests of your beneficiaries. If we go to the second of 4 pillars, they then address integrity. And the Council says you must have systems to ensure your decisions are robust, that they can be defended in the town square. And I think this is an area where most boards in Australia, to my experience, have this worked out. That when they're making decisions, they know they're going to be accountable to a funder, to a government, to a donor, or to their members. And having a defensible decision is almost a given in many cases, of course, not all. You need to consider the conduct of your own private life on the impact of charity. So how you conduct yourself in business, how you conduct yourself socially, has an impact on the charity. Now this is a bit confusing with my earlier statement that when you are a director of a charity, it's not you personally, it's the entity. But of course, the individual reputation impacts the charity, which comes to how do you select your directors to ensure that they are people of good standing and merit in the first place. You've got to ensure resources are managed and protected. Due diligence with those you do business with, commercial partners, needs to be assured. And you need to be aware to the impacts on the environment of your activities and your safe use of resources. So here's a second body. The National Council of Voluntary Organisations, different from the UK Charity Commission, saying environmental matters are relevant to the good ethics of the governance of your organisation. Again, not something I think that is yet deeply embedded in Australia, but is something that is likely to become more so. Transparency is the third pillar. That you should operate on the presumption of openness to just about everything you do unless there's a very good reason. As a director of the National Disability Insurance Agency, I've regularly said we should post the minutes of our meeting on our website every time we meet as a symbol and also an actual avenue of being transparent about what it is we're discussing. To ensure that, because we're a publicly funded organisation, that there can be nothing to hide. Because I can tell you from inside the boardroom, there is nothing to hide. But because it's now a big organisation, the stakeholders that it engages with, the participants for which it exists, need to know that people are acting in their best interests. And I think openness, which is encouraged by the NCVO for all charities, is one way of demonstrating your commitment through publishing information that is not mandatory to do so. You should also have very clear lines of responsibility between governance and management and understandings of those accountabilities. When you have blurred roles between governance and management, as all of us know, it creates headaches, but it also means you get distracted from your purpose because you're involved in the internal politics of your organisation. Finally, the fourth pillar of an ethical framework, according to the NCBO, is that of the right to be safe. And there's some challenges that the Council has put into us here as well. And it goes without saying that every beneficiary should live within the environment where their rights are protected, that they have the opportunity to complain when there is a breach, and there are systems of safety in place. That also applies for staff, not just because it's there at law, but because as a charity, we have that extra requirement to fulfil our purpose of people, which is ultimately behind the reason for many charities. We have to have a system of preventing abuse. We have to create a culture where it's okay to talk about risks and safety, and indeed when abuse or bullying is occurring, and directors should themselves be willing to call it out and name it and deal with it. Everyone who works for a charity, be they a volunteer or a staff member or a director, should also have access to a system where they witness unacceptable behaviour. And unacceptable behaviour is not just that which should be reported for breach of law, breach of OH&S responsibility, or bullying and harassment. The Council is creating an even greater layer to say, what are the values of your organisation and what's unacceptable? And do you call it, and do you have a system to run it through? Now that's a lot of information that I've just bucketed on you in a few moments. You've got the slides for future referral. And this is not code in Australia. It's not law. But it's the most recent, and I think best practice guide on what ethics within the governance of a charitable organisation looks like. And if you'll take my advice, knowing that we are a few years behind the UK, you might expect these types of principles at a point in the not too distant future to flow into the own thinking of oversight of the charity sector in Australia. First through voluntary codes, AICD, Governance Australia codes, but then perhaps through other codes where the regulator looks at what is the way in which we can assure that ethical standards are pursued within the not-for-profit sector. Turn to the second area that I was asked to address, that of culture, the culture within the governance of our not-for-profit organisations. Sarah Carter is someone that I met on one of my visits to the United Kingdom, and I have spent time there watching the charity sector and the human services sector in particular to see what it means for Australia. And Sarah has written about culture as a system of shared beliefs. So culture is not the behaviour of one, but the system in which many come together and interact. We've heard it before, but that method of knowing how people act when no one else is looking, that's the culture. Not how you behave when the VIP has come to cut the ribbon of the opening, but rather what happens after the facility's been opened and the care or the service is being provided. Now the system is built around individuals. It starts with us, but then it's the interaction of individuals over time that needs to be determined and decided and articulated. And they fail if they're not inclusive of all. If you don't involve all within your organisation, you have a culture that is one that's divided. The best way to ensure the culture that is created that you're after is to recruit from the beginning, knowing what it is you're looking like. And I know that many charities, my own and those that I observe, are pretty good at that in their recruitment of staff. Something often changes in the way in which board recruitment is undertaken. In board recruitment, you look for the skill set, the experience. Have you been a director before? Have you got the knowledge of the enterprise that you'll be governing? But I wonder, have you ever been asked as a director going in, or have you asked a director that you might bring in questions about culture? Some of you will have. All of you need to. It's now the first filter that we apply at Flying Doctors as to future director selection, before getting to skills, before getting to the contribution they make, but indeed, is the director going to relate to, fit into, and improve and grow the culture? If it's not there as a hallmark for what you're looking for, you won't get it. If you don't ask for it, you won't get it. So, what do we do in Australia to measure the effectiveness of culture within our charities and not-for-profit organisations? Some of you might participate in the AICD annual NFP survey, or at least receive the outcomes. It's a pretty good barometer of the health of charities in Australia. And the 2018 survey said that the top measures for culture and effectiveness within charities is staff survey results, good place to start, staff turnover, which is usually a negative, how many people are leaving, client surveys, the customers, the beneficiaries, work and health safety, and client complaints. So you might look at that and say, yeah, that's what I expected it to be. Some of them are probably positive, some of them are deficit, staff turnover and complaints in particular, but what other measures have we got? That's pretty good. Well, just have a look at what the Fortune 500 companies in the United States use as their measures for culture. Now, this survey is a bit dated, acknowledged. It's also US as opposed to Australia. But it's a very different approach. They're all in the positive. So culture is judged by, does an existing employee want to refer someone else to work for us? Is this place so good that I want my friend to come and work here? Do the staff that are there seek to stay? And are they being developed so that they can be promoted? Are staff coming back? Have they known that because they left us, they've gone somewhere else and our place is so good, they've come back to us? How often is the employee assistance program used? Well, to some charities in Australia, I'd say, do you have an employee assistance program in place? The parking lot at closing time. Now, I don't agree with this one because this is a two-way street. I don't want presenteeism to be the way in which you judge the effectiveness of the culture of an organisation. In fact, my office in Canberra, I have a relatively modest size office in Canberra. We have a staff team based there of 15. I judge a good day when we get to our 10 a.m. video meeting every single day at 10 a.m. My immediate staff team video in at 10 for 5 minutes strictly. And a good day is when not a soul is in the office, but that everyone's at work, no matter where they are in the country or at home, but they're videoed in and the office is empty. So in the US, they're saying, yeah, we want to see people still here at 6, 7 or 8 o'clock at night. Well, I don't think that's a good indicator. But what you might translate it at is that people are working, they're productive, they're engaged. I hope that's what it means. And that the business itself gets business leads, opportunities for business growth and development from its employees itself. What a stark difference in the way in which we measure culture between charities in Australia, and I think about 5,000 charities respond to the AICD survey, compared to for-profit companies, the big ones in the US. The best point is probably somewhere in between, I would think. But there's a positive perspective here around the measures of culture compared to perhaps the more black hat measures that charities in Australia are pursuing. So the third part of my discussion with you today, I'll just pause and say, how are we going? Is this okay? The third part of this discussion today is to whiz you through in 20 minutes a doctoral thesis. And the doctoral thesis was on how do directors contribute to outcomes. And I came to this idea when I joined the National Heart Foundation, and I said to the then chair, there were 12 directors around the table. I, at that point, was the only one not a professor of something at the table, high achievers in this group. And after a few meetings, I said to the chair, why is it with all of these great, capable, skilled, clever people, with a balance of diversity, the right skills mix, we just don't seem to be getting anywhere? And the professor said to me, I'm laughing, there's probably a doctoral thesis in that. And I'm being a bit flippant with that story, but there was. How is it you get a group of people who've got all the right stuff but aren't working? How do you get them to work effectively? Well, the foundation for this study is that our structure of corporate governance in Australia is not designed for not-for-profits and charities, full stop. We work under corporations law. If you're an association, you still effectively work under a corporate law framework, one that's set up for the pursuit of profit. If you're an unincorporated association, if you're an unincorporated activity, you're about to lose your house and the shirt that you're standing in, so I'd be doing something about that. But our practice of the way in which we govern is still seen through the lens of a structure set up to manage a shareholder return. So therefore, how can you expect our approach to governance to work if we're working within something that wasn't designed for us as the charity sector? So that was the foundation of the research. Yet, there are links even within that confused structure to the way in which the board behaves and the fulfilment of its purpose. So it's not all bleak. And there's a set of dynamics that when they're absent, the board doesn't work, and when they're present, the board fires in relation to achieving its purpose. And that's what I set out to test and prove. The governance structures that we have in Australia and in most of the English-speaking world have their origins in the Industrial Revolution, when the cotton mills of England were established and wealthy landowners wanted to prevent those who managed their cotton mills from stealing or putting their hand in the till. So the design of our corporate governance systems come from that preserve my asset, keep it close, build up the balance sheet, which is the opposite of what should be the purpose of charity. Charity isn't about balance sheets, it's about the beneficiaries. Accountants in the room struggle with this. Yet if we're working through that lens, how do we ensure that we have governance work for us? There's a further confusion that in a corporate structure, you know who the shareholders are, you know who the owners are. There's an actual accountability back to who owns the capital that you have to account for. The ASX sets rules around those behaviours and requires you to disclose anything material that might impact the return on capital for the owners of those shares. That's so important. Every Australian with superannuation wants that protection to be in place, because I don't mind admitting I don't pay close attention to the management of my shareholdings that inform my superannuation. Yet when we come to the not-for-profit sector, there is no owner. Your charity, it might have a membership, it might have an original trust document that sets it up, and it will certainly have revenues that come from a place to fulfil the purpose. But who owns the joint? And who are you then accountable for? Well, this is referred to as the multiple principle framework. There's multiple owners who are your directors, your members, those who fund you, governments, individual donors, and the beneficiaries. So the board is accountable, but not accountable to all of those people all at once. And that's a confusing environment within which to operate. Because of this absence of the profit motive, there isn't really a consensus on how to measure what's a successful contribution through a charity to a purpose. So we rely on financial performance. We look each year to ensure that the balance sheet is growing as a proxy for is the charity sustainable. It doesn't demonstrate if you're fulfilling your purpose. And if you don't have a method of knowing, how can you set a strategic plan to ensure that your purpose is going to be achieved in the coming year? And in fact, it's very often only the board directors themselves, those who are meant to be accountable, but they might only be the people who can tell if they're fulfilling their purpose or not. Because no one else, the members, very little, the beneficiaries who don't really have a voice, or the regulator who is appropriately distant and doesn't get under the bonnet of your business to know. It's really only the directors that are in that special position. So we then need to be careful that the best practice guides that are used, and if you've done an AICD course, be it the lengthy AICD course or the day-long or the Governance Australia course or any other form of governance training, you want to first ask, am I being taught governance for profit, or is it governance for purpose? And I'm a fan of the AICD, but they exist for the commercial world, and their lens doesn't easily adapt to the purpose world. We do get, when you do those programs, the template designed for the corporation, not for the beneficiary. And an awareness, a mindfulness, an acknowledgement of that is the way to position yourself for the bundled mechanisms, those different levers that you're going to have to make sure are in place if your governance is going to contribute to its purpose. So let's step through about 20 different dynamics that, in the absence of a governance system built for us, can actually work to ensure your board contributes to your purpose or it achieves the reason that you exist. The first is that your board has to be strategic, even the small ones. Management committees that are very close to running the day-to-day are so terribly important, but even then, they've got to be strategic at their level to ensure they're contributing to the organisation. If a board, when it meets, is determining what the raffle prize is every meeting, it's not particularly strategic, rather than what's the best way in which it can fulfil the reason that it exists. So the board needs to be strategic. Easier said than done, particularly with voluntary boards of small scale. The second is that the board itself has to be participative. Sorry to be harsh, but if there's a passenger on your board, they're taking up a seat that could be filled by someone who can contribute. And how often in voluntary organisations does the chair say, oh yes, but so-and-so has been such a generous supporter, they've been here for so long, and how could I possibly, it had caused so much upset. Well, what do you exist for? That director or the purpose? It's a bit harsh, but if you go back to what's an ethical framework for governance that says put the beneficiary first, well, it's not ethical to allow a traveller or a passenger to sit on the board. And the full board has to be participatory. Every director has to be contributing. And again, if it's not there, you can make it. Don't be defeated if this is absent from your experience. The reason for naming these dynamics is that you can inject them or foster them if they're absent. The board should be transparent. The more transparent a board is, the greater the accountability, the greater the focus on making good decisions and contributing to outcomes. It's the reason that the ASX runs its disclosure regime, anything material being reported the moment it happens. I think in this country, for large organisations, and let's say any organisation, any charity in excess of $100 million, I think it should report to the ACNC any material matter the moment it becomes aware of it, in the same way that a listed company reports to the ASX. And when it reports, it should say what it's going to do about it. Isn't that a bit burdensome? Well, if it's good enough for investors' money, where the only thing at risk is profit, but for the charity, who might be an aged care provider, a healthcare provider, looking after vulnerable children, shouldn't the burden be even higher? But for some reason, there's a different lens. Now, I didn't give the disclaimer at the beginning of this discussion. The views I express today are my own. They don't necessarily reflect either my employer or the multiple boards I'm involved with. But you might appreciate that as we think about, as a nation, how to ensure the safety and the benefit to beneficiaries, these types of concepts, where you can borrow them from the corporate sector, become more of an option. Ownership of stock is not something that anyone on a charity board is allowed to do because there's no private benefit. But the literature tells us that on listed companies, if a director is an owner of part of the business, they're more likely to invest and contribute to its well-being because there's skin in the game, there's something at risk, or they've got a great passion about it. So translating that to the not-for-profit sector, every director of a board should be invested in the cause. You can translate the idea of ownership as that they really want to be involved in this organisation. They're not there for themselves. They're not there because they want to get nominated for an IM. They're there because of the purpose. They want to contribute to the purpose. And have you tested that when you recruit the director? And have you ensured that in your annual director review, which I know everyone in this room does, that you've asked for the individual to demonstrate how they invested in the charity? For some it might mean they've made a donation. I think requiring directors to donate is an American tradition that we in this country should resist. How a board director in the corporate sector can contribute to the outcomes of their business. Let's now step to a review of literature of the not-for-profit sector, where we see that the active participation of a donor on a board contributes to a better organisational outcome. Now what this means is that if you've got a philanthropist or a significant contributor, that they actually want to see an outcome from their contribution and that they may have a role to play in the governance of the organisation. Now, let me be controversial. Governments are the principal funders of charities in Australia. The last year, the 2018 ACNC activity review of the 55,000 charities in Australia said that there was a total revenue of 130 billion for the charity sector in the last financial year, and roughly 50% of revenue came from fee-for-service or customer-purchased care. Think aged care, NDIS, but we know that behind that is government revenue, so that figure is perhaps a little grey. 40% comes from government grants, direct government grants, and then 10%, it's actually 8%, so it's smaller, 8% comes from charitable donation. If you stop someone in the town square and said, where does the charity get its revenue from? In fact, when I'm asked, where does the Flying Doctors get its money from, I'm usually told it's all donations, isn't it? Flying Doctors is 90% funded by government to do the work where Medicare doesn't work in this country. We operate beyond the boundaries of Medicare, and that's a government obligation. But most donors would think we're almost the other way around. 90% donor funded, maybe 10% government. And it's true for so many charities in Australia. We're mostly government funded because of outsourcing of government services, privatisation of public services in many cases. But should then government have participation on boards of charities if they're delivering services and government is the principal fund? Or is the method of contracting a sufficient way for government to see a return on investment? Could government do that anyway? To some extent the question is academic, because government wouldn't have the time, capacity or will to have a director on every board, because all of a sudden they then take on the liability. But gee, it changed the way in which charities become transparent, open and accountable. So I don't advocate government appointees to boards, but I do advocate greater transparency above that which is mandatory reporting back to governments. Believe me this, if you as a charity are providing something back to government that's over and above your contractual obligations, next time your contract review comes up or next time you ask for something, you're going to have a much better potential of getting a favourable outcome than just meeting mandatory conditions all the time. The engagement of board directors in resource gathering again continues with this theme of in connection with government. A director coming to a board should be willing to get their hands dirty in getting the resources for that organisation. Fundraising, yes, but more so garnering the human capital, the connections with local community, and providing the networks for the management or the chief executive or the committee to be able to do its business. I'm very lucky to have on my board Amanda Vanstone, who some of you will know. She's my chair. And Amanda's great contribution, other than telling some terrific jokes to start everybody in the board meeting, mostly at John Howard's expense, is to provide access to the networks. And my board is terrific at providing access to networks. So that's resource gathering. And it's the way in which a director can contribute to the outcome by opening a door to a donor, to a council to get an approval, or to a government to receive a revenue opportunity. And that way that director's made a direct contribution to the outcome. Board and chief executive turnover is also recognised in the literature as a means of ensuring the contribution to outcome. Now don't misinterpret it. It doesn't mean you want much turnover. Actually, the benefit is of reasonable tenure. And the rule that a chief executive is most effective in their 6th year and should go in their 7th is borne out in the literature. A study of 5,500 firms in the United States revealed that the best length of tenure for a chief executive and a board partnership, that is the chair and the CEO together, needs 7 years for them to be most effective. If you've got constant turnover, you're busy on the board politics, you're busy on organisational change, you're not doing your purpose. Sometimes it's unavoidable because life happens and people move on by choice or have to be moved on against. But recruiting and setting up expecting a CEO and a chair to be there in that partnership for 7 years, it's not subjective, it's what the evidence tells us is as effective and the best way to ensure that the executive governance contribution to outcomes is fulfilled. Now, let me confuse you. In Australia, there is a hidden secret that some charities operate with 2 boards. And I'm not referring to federations where you might have a national board and then state boards. I'm referring to single organisations that have 2 boards. And an illustration is St Vincent's Hospital at Darlinghurst, the Calvary Hospitals, Calvary Mater up the road at Newcastle. It's got 2 boards. It's got a management board and then it's got a trustee board on top of that. And they have 2 different jobs. The management board runs the business and it's everything you'd expect out of a corporate board. The trust runs the purpose. They exist for a sole reason, and that's to articulate what the mission is and to make sure that mission is being followed. So that place for purpose is given a home in a legal structure that says purpose is so important it gets its own board. And then management and governance is also really important, so it's got its own. And the management board is accountable back to the trust for showing how it fulfills purpose. The trust is not allowed to interfere in the business. It's confusing, but they can if the purpose is not being achieved, is not being fulfilled, if they're heading in the wrong direction. And from time to time, we see that happen. There's now about 20 substantial, mostly health and aged care groups in Australia, and they mostly come from a church heritage that are using 2 boards. This is referred to as the Germanic governance. Boards in Germany, in France, in Japan, increasingly in China, have 2 boards. And the structure in Germany will see the trust board comprised of union representatives, customers, and representatives of the owners of capital. And then the management board is the corporate directors that you'd expect to see. I think this structure, the 2-tier board structure, has extraordinary opportunity for big charities where there is the capacity to think this through, to say one group of people's job is purpose, the other group is running the place, and let's see how that works. If you've got bureaucracy in 2 layers, and if you don't clearly define the difference, it's a nightmare. Let me tell you, it's a nightmare. And I've been involved in helping to mediate some of these nightmares for these groups. But if I can refer you to a West Australian hospital group, St John of Healthcare, it introduced a 2-tier board almost 25, 30 years ago. So it's been at it for a while now. And at that stage, you had about half a dozen hospitals, and it was turning over maybe $200–300 million each year. So it was a big affair. It today turns over $2 billion. It's got hospitals across the country, across New Zealand. It's gone from strength to strength. And the directors attribute so much of that as to splitting out who looks after purpose, hospitals, and who looks after management. So I just commend this idea of the 2-tier board to you. And if you're interested, I wrote a thesis on it. And you could spend 86,000 words wandering your way through. But there's some evidence that where there are 2-tiered boards in place, you have to have a sufficiently sized board matched to the enterprise. And one of the questions I'm so often asked when I give these discussions on governance is, what's the right size for a board? And the answer is there is no right size. It's one that mirrors the needs of your enterprise at the particular time in the life cycle of your organisation. A board of 3 people might be appropriate in some circumstances, if that's what the enterprise needs. A board of 15 sounds ridiculous, I wouldn't do it. But somewhere in between, 5, 7, 9, and once you get past that, you're starting to get a little large. But the point is that it has to be sufficiently sized to ensure it is active to relate to the enterprise that you go to. And only the directors at the time can make that proper assessment. And that's why there is not a rule in this country, and there never should be, about what's the right size of the board. Only that it should be sufficiently sized to the enterprise and it be active given the life cycle of the organisation. It has to be firmly independent. It can't be in the management's pocket. And friendships that very often occur, they might be in place before someone comes onto a board, or over time you become friendly with management. They're to be guarded against, because that's how you start to diminish the independence of the board, both among the directors, but also particularly with management. And there's also a risk then that you can be too independent. And there's literature that says if directors come to an enterprise of which they have no experience, if you've ever seen, I say this very respectfully, but a banker come to an arts group, and if there's not a passionate connection, some bankers are very artistic, some aren't. And if there isn't an understanding of the enterprise that you're governing, you're too independent, you're too distant to be able to contribute. So independence means you can't have that close connection with the management or with other directors at a personal level. But nor do you have to, can you be entirely foreign to what it is you're governing. The person needs to have an empathy at the very least with the enterprise that's being governed. And that the work knowledge, their experience relates somehow. Now that speaks to what is the skills mix? Have you got the right skills? But as a lawyer, you don't always need a lawyer on a board. You don't always need an accountant on the board. In the mix, you need those who are aware of their legal obligations and are aware of their financial literacy. In fact, I'd go further and say every single director on your board needs to be able to satisfy both of those requirements. They have to understand their legal obligations or they're at personal risk. They have to be able to understand the P&L and the balance sheets, where the money comes from, where it goes, how it's recorded, how you defend it. That's every director's obligation, and the evidence certainly says that's true. So when I surveyed the directors as part of my PhD, I was asking the question, what in your opinion contributes to the director contributing to outcomes? How does a director actually add value to the business? And the answers that came back that were defensible and reliable are that the board is a group of wise people who should add value to the business. And management should be able to look to them to help them solve challenges and take advantage of opportunities. The board should focus on purpose. And the board, in fact, I think every meeting, every board agenda should be structured somehow to say, what is our purpose and how are we fulfilling it? If you can look at your agenda and see, I get our purpose, and this, what we're about to talk about, fulfills that, that means you're at the right place contributing. If you look at it and it doesn't look like it's your purpose, then you have to ask, well, are we contributing to our outcome? This practice of governance gets better over time, which speaks to experienced directors, but also the experience of the group. Has the group bonded? Does it put effort into building the board bonds? Again, you don't want to be friends as directors necessarily, but you do want to have a bond so that you've got a relationship to be able to work, and that gets better over time. Are you crystal clear in your directions? Does management leave the meeting knowing what it is that's just being agreed? Is there absolute clarity in what's been determined? And are you acting on behalf of the beneficiaries? Does the board know who their beneficiaries are? Does it have an information flow to know what they want? And are those decisions holding up the mirror of the beneficiaries? What would the client do? What would the consumer want? What would the person that we exist for expect of this decision? And that's almost a discernment framework to sit at the board table and have your beneficiary in your head and act on their behalf. They're the shareholder. What do they want? Because if you're, as a board, not acting on their behalf, no one is. The board itself exists to legitimise the organisation. Now, what does that mean? Well, there has to be someone who is accountable, responsible for decisions. So every chief executive or every manager should come to the board to say, here is my very clear recommendation on the action you should take. But it's ultimately the board that gives legitimacy to that decision. Once they've made that decision, that board owns it. It wasn't just management's responsibility. The board's then embraced it. It's theirs. And they are the accountable and legitimate authority for both the success, but also the error or the breach if that occurs. And if you think that way, that you're the legitimised, every time you come to a decision, you can't blame management. If you've embraced it, if you've endorsed it, and hopefully it is management's recommendation, but then it's yours. So don't make it if you're not willing to defend it. Don't just slide it through because management knows best. No. It's legitimising management is your role, and you're giving accountability in place. The board has a particular role when a crisis occurs. And if the board steps back and waits for management in a real crisis and isn't willing or up to the task, the board shouldn't be there. And the crisis can be as minor as the interests of the beneficiaries are being neglected. I shouldn't say that's minor, but I'm about to build up to something more significant where a beneficiary has been harmed and management perhaps hasn't acted fast enough or is seeking to excuse, and the board has to step in. You should know where your threshold is. And I think good boards scenario plan. In the good times, when they're not in crisis, they think, well, where are our lines of no-go? Where would we say management has acted inappropriately or pushed too far or put us at risk, and we'd be willing to step in? This doesn't often sit in risk management frameworks articulated like that, of where is the boundary that the board will step in when something goes wrong. A well thought through risk management might lead you up to that point, but the board itself needs to know that it has to be willing to act. The way in which the board behaves, fish rots from stuff, the way in which the directors interact with management and set a tone, cascades through the organisation. And if the board's in conflict, expect the organisation to feel that. If the board is clear and strategic and focused on purpose, so too should management follow if the systems are there. In order to achieve all this, you've got to select the right people. And I can't overemphasise recruiting. It can't be, I'm going, it's my job to fill someone, and I know this fella down the road, therefore. Those times have passed. And voluntary organisations that have relied on that need a more thought-through process of recruiting today than they did once. All of this comes together, and in your takeaway, I see it's far too small to be able to see. But each of the 20 dynamics that I've just stepped through briefly, that come together in a framework, I think are substitutable for the failures of our for-profit governance framework that we work in. That because we all use the corporations law and we have the experience as directors of working for profit, if you're focused on the purpose of your charity, you can assess your board dynamics by surveying, by professional development of your directors, and ask, pick one out at a meeting and say, are we clear in setting directions? Yes, no. And ask management, are we clear in setting directions? Do you know where we're going, both in the micro and the macro? Do we have a strategic plan that you understand that's implementable? Pick another dynamic and ask management, are we a functional board? Do we work or not? That's almost foundational. The board's got to be functional. This framework that draws on the surveys and the review of literature and is now published and available is what I recommend as a filter to see within the corporate governance framework of corporations law. If you're focused on the purpose of your organisation and you want your directors to contribute to it, you need to see these dynamics present. If they're not there, work on them. If they are there, acknowledge them and maintain them. And this framework I've tested now in 8 organisations, and those 8 organisations were on different ranges of the spectrum. One from having only 3 present in their self-assessment, and over a 2-year period they worked themselves up to 18. Other organisations on the other end of the spectrum, both management and board agreed that they had almost 80% of them at start, and they lifted up. And they now use this as their annual review point to ensure that they're focused on contributing to their organisation's purpose. And that's the difference between this framework and perhaps others, that it's aimed at the organisational purpose. I'm briefly going to speak to the 4 Royal Commissions that I think are going to be relevant to some of you, and it's going to be brief. The first, and I had a small involvement in it, and I suspect some in this room may have as well, was the now concluded Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sex Abuse. About 16 volumes of that report were published. There was broad acceptance of governance of the findings, but not all of the recommendations have been actioned. When a Royal Commission makes a report, and not all recommendations are actioned, they sit on the public record, and they're available for government in years ahead to slowly ingrain into policy, to regulation, to law and requirements. And one that I myself feel vulnerable about is that which relates to the child-safe standards. If you're an organisation that's involved in the direct care and support of children, I'm going to guess that you're now child-safe. But the Royal Commission wasn't just speaking to those whose purpose is child support or child safety. They're actually speaking to all sport, recreation, arts, culture, community and hobby groups across Australia. The language is deliberate. A hobby group may not be incorporated. It may not be an entity of itself, but it's a number of people coming together. I classify the Flying Doctors within this list. I consider us a community group. Not sport, not rec, not arts, not culture, not hobby, but I think we're a community group. So my interpretation is that this is a policy that probably applies to us at a future point, even if at law it doesn't apply to us directly today, although we have obligations under the licensing of our healthcare services. But it says pointedly, board directors are to be directly accountable for a child safety culture. There must be a method for children to express their views in decisions that affect their lives. All children have access to a complaint process, and families and communities are involved in policies and practices. So I won't embarrass you, I'll embarrass me. How does the Flying Doctors do? Standard 1, tick. We've got a framework for child protection and accountabilities within our organisation. Standard 2, fail. We don't have a specified method for children to participate in decisions of the Flying Doctors. And applying that literally we would. 3, families don't have a say in the way in which we set the policies and practice of the Flying Doctors. Fail. Standard 4, have a complaints process accessible to children. That exists, but I want to go back and review it against the child safety standards to see how it fits. And I hope you appreciate the honesty that I've just undertaken in relation to this. I'm doing so because whatever organisation you represent, I'm going to guess you might tick them all, or you might think, you better go have a look at that. This is not the law. Yeah. It's a recommendation of the Royal Commission. And this Royal Commission's recommendations, at time, will find their way into the statute books. They'll find their way into regulation. And I think getting ahead of it and preparing for it, and knowing that it's the board directors, the board governance that's ultimately accountable for things. Royal Commission number 2 is into the banking sector, and you might wonder why I'm going to talk about that in this room, because we're not banks, and I was even critical of bankers earlier. Sorry for all bankers present. But the Commission made 2 recommendations about culture and governance that I'll guarantee will come to a board near you at some point if they haven't already. And they are that boards should be regularly assessing the entity's culture and its governance, identifying problems and determining what changes have been are needed and if those changes work. Now again, this is the financial services sector, it's not the charitable sector. But regulators in Australia talk to each other and they look at the findings of other regulators. The financial services industry is now being regulated in this way. You might expect at a future point that a regulator for the charitable sector would say, well, if it's good enough for the banks, it's even more important for charities to be looking at, are you reviewing the culture of your organisation and governance role in it, and are you amending it when needed? The third Royal Commission currently underway is that into quality and safety of aged care services, and I know some of you in this room will be involved in that. I'm not going to make any particular comment about that commission underway other than when the call for self-reporting of known incidents was made and the request by the beginning of February for approved aged care providers to self-report to the commission, only half met that deadline. Every bank in Australia met the deadline for self-reporting of known incidents, every bank. And look at what trouble the banks got themselves into. Half of aged care services in Australia have missed their deadline. If I was on an aged care board that had missed its deadline, I'd want to know why, and then I'd want to drive to Adelaide tomorrow, fly to be faster, and lodge my submission and self-report. This principle of self-reporting is not something that we can hide from, and it's not something we want to hide from. As directors, when things go wrong, we want to know, we want to be upfront, we want to be transparent, we want to fix, because that's what our purpose requires, no matter what domain we're involved in. And you might expect that this mechanism of calling royal commissions or inquiries is likely to continue, and we're now doing policy change via our commissions, and aged care has only just begun, yet the sector's ability to respond is already showing itself wanting. There's just been, last week, the Prime Minister announced the establishment of the Royal Commission into neglect, abuse and harming people with disabilities in Australia. And this will be a very wide-ranging commission occurring over coming years. The Commission's focus is not just on institutions, it is on the care and support, the respect, in fact, that our communities give to people with disabilities. It will be wide-ranging. Whilst it's not commenced its processes, the terms of reference have only just been published, the Commission has named only last week. For those of you involved in disability, I'll be doing something straight away. I'll be going back to the aged care inquiry and looking what did the Aged Care Commission require in approved aged care providers. And it asked, before the Commission started, for self-reporting of known incidents of abuse and neglect, and indeed remedy in response to those known circumstances. If you're involved in disability, I'd be preparing for the Royal Commission into disability, or people with disabilities, to take a very similar approach and know that it's not necessarily looking into institutions per se, but rather prospectively, how can we ensure an Australian society that genuinely honours and respects and treats as ordinary people with disabilities so that they may have the ordinary opportunities that every Australian is entitled to. Boards can't run from these Royal Commissions because if the board is the legitimiser of the organisation, it is the board that is accountable to these judicial processes for ensuring the sound and safe operation of their organisations for the purpose that they exist. I'm going to conclude briefly with some suggestion of some how-to guides, some guides that I think are almost mandatory for boards to have. The first is the ACNC's Good Governance Guide. If you don't know it, here it is summarised into 10 dot points. You can click on the link and download it. Ideally, your board sees this once a year, and you might even have this form part of your annual board review. At a point in time, I think you've got to sign off on the annual information statements to say you comply with the good governance principles, the 5 governance standards of the ACNC. If, as a director of a board, you don't know these, or your colleagues don't know them, because you do now, you're looking at them, ensure that all of your directors are familiar and that they can at least be, at one point in your annual board cycle, appearing in your board minutes so that you're showing that you're complying if a Royal Commission at some stage ever wanted to look. The second guide is that of the AICDs, and it's even a little further developed, and it's a pretty good one, I have to say. I know that you've had Phil Butler speak at one of these gatherings previously, and Phil is the principal author of this after consultation. Again, its focus, and it starts off with that the organisation's purpose must be clearly articulated and it must have a strategy that fulfils its purpose. That key word comes back. What's the purpose, and are you doing everything around that? These are a useful guide in addition to the ACNC's, a bit more detailed. But so is the ASX corporate governance principles and recommendations. These are often spoken about in NFP boardrooms, but not often tested and put into practice. And I think they are relevant, better than the AICD or the ACNC. They speak to the knowledge of risk and ask to ensure that your board and your organisation has a risk framework in place. And I'm not sure why the AICD or the ACNC isn't as demanding about risk. I think it should be. Perhaps because we know that the job of the ASX director is to manage someone else's money, which is purely about financial risk. You see that focus. But every NFP board, no matter its size, needs to have at least a basic outline of a risk management approach. And the ASX is a pretty good place to start with that. A few moments again back to the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom, I think, have thought this through even better than we have yet here in Australia. In the UK, the Charities Commission says, again, start off with a clear articulation of your purpose. Ensure that you have effective and strategic board leadership. And it uses the word leadership as opposed to management, because that's the job of the board, to lead in a strategic direction. You need to have values to create the right culture within your organisation, clearly understood, relevant to your purpose. Your decision-making processes have to be sufficiently informed. Have you got enough information? And are you making your decisions on form rather than gut instinct or personal preference? Is the board effective working as a team? Is its approach to diversity and leadership and decision-making effective? And this is the first time you see diversity pop into our how-to guides. The ASX, the AICD and the ACNC don't speak of diversity, but the UK does. And then finally, they conclude with the notion of transparency. Are you transparent in the way you make your decisions? I've gone through these how-to guides quickly because they're just worth rereading regularly. Now that you've got the 4 of them, you might want to mend them and mould them to your own circumstance and bring each of those principles to the way in which your board works. So, I've probably said too much, and there's certainly too much in what I've shared with you to repeat back in the test that I'm about to conduct. So, instead, the 3 takeaways that I suggest for your application in your boardroom or in your management team when you return. The first, which you might have guessed, is that if you're not clear on your purpose, and if it's not shared in its understanding by your directors, define it and build it around directing your response to the area of most need with the evidence to ensure you're going to have the greatest impact on that need. Your purpose, evidence of need, and the evidence that you're going to have the most impact in achieving that purpose. The second is that recruit everyone with the object of fulfilling that purpose. If you know what your purpose is, talk about it in your board recruitment. Talk about it in your volunteer recruitment and in the way in which you engage your staff. And if purpose is not part of that recruitment process, how will you achieve the purpose that your organisation exists for? Finally, if your purpose needs to be adjusted to move with the times or move with the need, that's fine. You're not restricted to what you decided to do 100 years ago. But you might have to adjust your constitution, your mission statements, your plans, your business plans, your board agendas, all of that stuff, the architecture of your organisation, to cascade your purpose through. I think the most important place to see purpose present is in the meeting agenda for every single board meeting, in your annual board review. Don't ask, were our meetings run on time? Was the chair good at involving everyone in discussion? Yeah, that's important. But the real question is, did we fulfil our purpose? Did we do what we came to do? Was our purpose achieved? Or did we get distracted by something not well done? If your purpose isn't in the KPIs of the chief executive, why not? It's in mine. But it's there because I said to my boss, these KPIs look a bit vanilla, a bit generic. What's our purpose? And that's why if you saw the Sunday Telegraph yesterday, on the front page, there is a campaign to heal the bush. It's focused on ensuring that country Australia has the same access to healthcare as people in the city. The Flying Doctors wasn't an advocate a few years ago, but we now are. Because our purpose is ensuring that people in country Australia get healthcare and have no barriers in access to a good health outcome. That's our purpose. We've previously done that by flying in, flying out healthcare, and we'll continue to do that because that's our purpose. But we thought through what's the best way in which we can be effective to adjust and align our foundational documents to fulfilling the purpose. Well, we realised we also needed to change government policy to see more healthcare provided to the bush, even if it's not from us. It's not a grab for us, but a grab for our beneficiary because that's our purpose. So therefore, my KPIs are built around purpose, as are our board agendas, our constitution, our foundational documents. If you embed purpose everywhere, you're likely to see best achieved